This video will discuss utilizing an indirect cost rate. To begin, what is an indirect cost? Indirect costs are costs that benefit multiple cost objectives. They're costs incurred in positions that touch all area of an entity's business, such as the office of the superintendent or the treasurer. Expenses incurred by indirect positions cannot be assigned to a specific fund or grant and therefore cannot be charged to a grant. As a result, indirect expenditures are typically paid from the general fund. Utilizing an indirect cost rate can help spread indirect costs among applicable grants. Many state and federal grants administered by the Ohio Department of Education permit the use of an indirect cost rate. Indirect cost recovery is not mandatory. However, grantees deciding to utilize a rate for federally funded grants must submit a proposal annually which calculates a rate based on prior year financials. If you decide that utilizing an indirect cost rate would be beneficial for your federal awards, the Ohio Department of Education has prepared an indirect cost rate proposal as an Excel workbook. This workbook can serve as the annual submission as required by federal regulations and can be found on the department's website along with detailed instructions on how to complete the proposal. State grants have a little more flexibility and allow a set percentage to cover indirect expenses or defer to the indirect cost rate calculated in the proposal. You'll want to reach out to your program consultant to discuss the requirement to charge indirect costs to a state grant. Let's look at how having an indirect cost rate could benefit an entity by utilizing an indirect cost rate with your grants. First, let's look at the difference between direct and indirect costs. As you know, grants are awarded to an entity for a specific purpose. For example, a Title I grant has specific objectives and grantees incur costs to meet those specific objectives. Such costs might include personnel, fringe benefits, and supplies. These types of expenditures fulfill the grant's purpose and are categorized as direct cost. Grantees must be able to demonstrate all direct expenses are for work applicable only to the grant. On the other hand, there are behind-the-scenes or indirect costs grantees incur in managing a grant. Indirect expenses normally are not as easy to track to a particular grant as a direct expense. Indirect functions may include costs associated with the offices of the treasurer or human resources or operations, as well as maintenance of plant services and other administrative or business support offices. When an entity utilizes an indirect cost rate, applicable grants absorb their fair share of these indirect expenses, thereby freeing up other funding sources such as the general fund. Here's a simplified example of how utilizing an indirect cost rate would be beneficial. If your Title I grant allocation is $250,000 and an indirect cost rate of 3% is utilized, indirect cost expenditures totaling a maximum of $7,500 can be charged to the Title I grant. This frees up $7,500 in the general fund for other expenses. While utilizing a rate frees up funding in other areas, it's important to remember that the indirect cost recovery does not increase your grant allocation. Therefore, the Title I grant in this example now has $242,500 remaining for program-specific direct expenditures. But the general fund, which can incur costs with less restriction, now has $7,500 more to use toward other expenses. Again, this is a very simplified example. If you decide to utilize an indirect cost rate, you'll learn that for federal grants, the rate must be applied to the modified total direct costs. More information about modified total direct costs can be found in the instructions. Now that we've seen general information about indirect costs, let's briefly talk about indirect cost rate proposals. The workbook proposal provides a way for districts to classify total costs, regardless of the funding source, into three categories: direct unallowable, indirect, and excluded. Separating costs into these categories will result in the calculation of two indirect cost rates, a restricted rate, and an unrestricted rate. The restricted rate is applicable to federal awards from the U.S. Department of Education that have a supplement, not supplant requirement. The unrestricted rate applies to funding sources such as Medicaid and food services programs. Ohio average restricted rate is 3%, and the unrestricted rate averages 14.7%. To recap, the submission of the indirect cost rate proposal is required for federal grants only. The proposal calculates a restricted and an unrestricted rate. State grants often set a rate contrary to the one approved in the proposal. However, there are times when the restricted or unrestricted rates are used with state grants. Therefore, it's necessary to contact the program office for further information about indirect costs to a state grant. For more detailed information about the indirect cost rate proposal process, go to education.ohio.gov and search for keywords Indirect Cost Rate Proposal.